Welcome to a beginner's guide to understanding parked pages and the IP addresses they reside on. This is going to be a practical task. There's going to be a short lecture on the front and then some practical application on the back end. This lecture is indeed aimed for very much beginners, folks that have just got into the industry, do not know all the cybersecurity tools, do not know how to necessarily navigate around and find out this kind of information if they were tasked to it. And so we're going to talk about some basics, some fundamental items and elements of this particular concept of parked pages and the IPs they reside on, and make sure that you know what equally basic and fundamental data points you need to collect. What you will see in the practical probably will not look like what you might do at a position if you had a beginner's position in cybersecurity. They will likely have an internal application, an internal way of querying, a broken out process, whatever that you'll want to follow. But the things you learn here, these very basic elements, will be bound up in that regardless of what the final application looks like, regardless of what kind of automation they may have in place for some of these elements we're going to discuss. What you learn here will be critical to being able to perform those actions the way they're looking for you to do. So let's go into this. And again, this is a practical task. In the description, you can find a jump point. If you've got to this part and you don't want to hear the lecture, but you want to see the practical, just jump down into the description and you can leap forward directly to the practical part. All right, let's get into this. It's necessary to talk about the ecosystem of parked domains before we go into any of the practical applications of trying to figure out what is a parked domain and what IP it's setting on. So let me take a second to do that. And it's important to really stress that there are four major, very different, frequently parties involved in this ecosystem. And it is indeed an ecosystem. There are domain owners, the folks who actually own the domains. They own the domain that may have a website on it, may not, but they definitely own that domain, and they're going to put it with someone called a parking service, which is another individual, if you will, another party in this particular ecosystem. And the parking service, they're going to take that domain and put it on an IP, often with thousands of others, and they're going to engage an advertisement syndicator who is going to provide back ads that they gain from an advertiser. And so the idea here is, in a kind of quick, rough introduction, is that the strategy will be that as long as doing those things brings back more money than the cost of owning and managing a domain, then this is a good strategy that is financially attractive. It's something you might think of as a passive investment, one where you might capitalize, if you will, on current events and hot topics, memes, and other things to make money. But more than anything else, you need to understand at this point in this lecture that this is an ecosystem. There are four major parties to it. The parking services provide the hosting and generate the content for the domain owners so they can monetize the domain names. And as the name fully suggests, domain owners park their domain names with a domain parking service who then takes over the management of that and in return gives the domain owners a share of their profits that they gain from ads. And parking services typically collaborate with advertisement syndicators to serve relevant ads from one of their advertising clients. And you can kind of see a model of this broken out on the screen. Just follow the lines, understand how they connect, see how everything is put together. There's certain areas that we care about more than others, for sure. Like when a domain owner selects a service to park his or her domains, they're going to configure the DNS settings of the domains to use the name servers of that parking service. And that's why I have this box for DNS there inside of parking service. That's something we particularly care about as cybersecurity researchers. And when a web user, someone browsing to it, later visits that domain, the parking page that's displayed is typically dynamically generated from the template I mentioned earlier. And at that point, the parking service will make sure they have included JavaScript code or potentially another kind of scripting language, but typically JavaScript, that will drive an ad syndicator to the park page and feed ads. They will fetch and attempt to display ads from their catalog of advertisers that will make sense to that domain and any other content that's there. So maybe as a full circle example, if security.com maybe is a better domain name, then I parked it, that park page would display ads relevant to the topic, in this case cybersecurity. And if you click on one, you would be sent to that advertiser's website through syndicator tracking and redirection mechanisms. That's why frequently if you're in this industry, you'll see activity where you'll go to a domain and then it'll immediately redirect you somewhere else. And it may redirect you a couple of times. Frequently that's because an ad is present there or the scripting for the syndicator is moving the user to another location, because sometimes they do some relatively sketchy things in the background that we care about, but it's a little bit beyond this lecture. The final thing that I want to get back on track with here is that the advertiser will pay the syndicator for a visitor. It's the whole reason they do this. And when they do that, they in turn will pay the parking service. And then finally, the domain owner is given the share for supplying the domain and getting the whole ball rolling. That's why you see the domain owner go left to the parking service. But then as things happen on the park website, it goes to the advertiser, and then it percolates up through the syndicator, the parking service, and the domain owner. So how do people end up on park domains? It's not in the diagram, but the short answer is following links in search engines, especially those that are deceptive or pretend to be something different. And also just from you not paying attention and clicking on things that look good but are not actually what they depict. Those are two sort of the same thing. Sometimes it's accidental and then it's not deceptive when it's accidental. Sometimes it is completely deceptive and on purpose. Also from just flat out not typing it right. Even though we have so many ways to grab the right answer, frequently we'll type it in, we'll mistype, and we'll hit that button, that enter button really quick, or return button, depending on your keyboard, and you will get going and not realize you've actually put in the wrong thing. And of course, there's folks like us, researchers and cybersecurity analysts who go there and kind of research and identify attacker activity. But still, it's mostly misclicking and mistyping more than anything else. And so this kind of helps, I hope, give you a little bit of background so far on what this all is about. Not only, what are park domains, parked pages, but why would people go there? And the IPs is part of this. So if you haven't attended the lecture about DNS, please do so, because one of the important things to understand is that a domain has to be on an IP address to be routable on the internet. I'll say it again. A domain has to be on an IP address to be routable on the internet. You cannot get to a domain if it's not a tenant connected to an IP address, because that IP address is literally the IP address of the server, the computer that has the content that you want to look at. So you have to be able to get to it, which is why it's important that if you end up going to a park domain and it's on an IP address, why we get so interested in that IP address, because we want to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to. We know that this is a behavior. Park domains have a normalized behavior. When malware writers, well, I guess cyber attackers would be a better way to describe it. When cyber attackers use park domains to either do command and control, which is to communicate back and forth with malware they may have embedded somewhere, or to actually infect someone with malware, or to use it as a place to exfiltrate or steal data out of an environment into their own, we want to figure that out. We want to find that and separate it from the legitimate park domain behavior. That's why, as cybersecurity analysts, we might care about whether an IP address is a regular parked IP address, because that deceptive measure is what we're kind of looking for. If I pretend to be a park page, that might be enough of a signal to your AI, which will not solve this, or to even analysts who may just miss it, that this really isn't a parked page. It's actually a stop on my chain of events to actually break in or pull data out of your environment. So it's really important to understand these. But at a beginner, you just need to know what they are and how to identify them as best as possible, and then pass that up to your junior, senior, and principal analysts above you so that they can work on this and get the deeper detail and perform the correlation analysis that would be necessary to fully determine whether something is good or bad, if you will. I always like to think of it as apprentices, especially in the beginning, as their beginner state, they always do all the presumptive type tests. You may have seen many of the forensic files or case files or all that other kind of TV around it. One of the things that they do all the time and they talk about is there's these presumptive tests, where they put down some kind of liquid to see if there's blood and it reacts a different color, or they do any of a number of tests like that. The whole idea is to see if it's necessary to do more, or if it resembles, the evidence they're looking at resembles a certain thing. All right, speaking of which, I said I'd mention the fundamental elements. So as a beginner, you kind of have three things that really fundamentally you need to pay attention to, and that's the IP address, which will equate to the A record. So there should be a lecture at this point. If not, they'll definitely do one on what records are in DNS. And so one of those is called an A, or a multiple A record, if you will. A record is the record that is the assignment for a IPv4 address. The quad A record, is for an IPv6 IP address. So host name which will be the name that it's go by. It's also by a canonical name, so CNAME record. And then lastly, the name server, which is the NS record. And so you're going to want all of those. And they will be in different formats. IP address will be in the quad octet format, unless it's an IPv6, then it'll be in the IPv6 format. Hostname will always be kind of human readable, as will the name server. So those are things that are a little helpful. And a lot of times we're looking at the parking service, which is why I've got the circle and the items right next to the parking service, because they're the ones who are actually hosting this. They're part of the deciding factor on whether this is a legitimate parked page IP or not, for example. So now you might be like, all right, how do I find these things? It's a lot of information. How do I do something with it? So just as an example, here's a couple of items that I just pulled out for you by basics. Sometimes it's very, very simple. Sometimes they tell you flat out it's parking. So Sedo parking, SEDO parking, they actually tell you, hey, we do parking services. And if you go and look them up, they put everything from their name servers on down to distinct IPs that tell you that, yes, this is a parked page. So something that is resolving, for example, to NS1, nameserver1.sedoparking.com, is definitely a good indicator that that's parked, that particular domain. Same thing for cache parking. They've integrated with GoDaddy, for example, and I put the IP there, the A record for 34.102.136.180, because it's a very consistent IP that you can count on has parking on it as far as domains being parked there. Same thing for Fabulous and Above and so on. They all are parking services that are very common. GoDaddy Namecheap to actually are domain registrars as well, so they're kind of combined together. In this case, GoDaddy wrapped cache parking service into their service, and so it's kind of in a pipeline. So these are far from the majority or even a tiny amount of the ones that are out there, but I wanted to give you a couple examples. So if you want to do some research on your own, you can definitely go out there, jump on these, click on them, look through them, see how it works, look at all the domains sitting on them, and kind of get a deeper sense in what it might look like. Now, I spoke behavior and about behavior and behavior patterns a few times earlier, and I wanted to take a second to talk about that. There is a basic pattern. Now, there's an extension to this, and again, it's something that someone that's trained to a junior or senior level will definitely dig into. But at your beginner level, as an apprentice, you really only want to look at a couple of things. So these 5 are basically the top patterns, top elements of a pattern that you want to look at that starts telling you that this is a parked page and it's sitting on a parked page IP. And so IP address has large volume of domains. So there's servers there, one IP per server. Sometimes one IP is split over multiple servers, but the reality is after it gets to a certain point, so you have, say, 5,000 or even 3,000 or 2,000, some thousands of domains can be on an IP address, and a server might be okay. It might, sustain behavior. But if you have how best to restate this? Part of the reason that this is a good indicator is the activity on a parked page server is very straightforward. It's there to host minimal content and to bring in ads, and it does very little else. And so because of that, the burden on that server is very light, and so a parking service or a registrar, whoever's parking a domain, can put tens of thousands easily domains and have them resolve there without killing that server. And that is a very typical pattern where registrars who register domains or parking services will push a lot of host names or domains to a particular IP address because it knows it can sustain that. That's why we look for that particular check in the behavior. A IP that has 3 domains on it is not anywhere near the same as one that has 30,000 domains on it. So it is an easy marker to look for. The second one, that the IP address is owned or leased by a parking service, like Sedo and cache parking. Sometimes they flat out just tell you they are a parking service. And so you will see things like pool and hosting and parked and things like that that indicate to you that that is indeed a IP address that is assigned to be a parked page IP. Remember, in the DNS records part, and please attend or look at that lecture if you haven't, when you look at the DNS records, one of the things in there that's commonly filled out is what they call reverse DNS. It's also called the host name, and that tends to indicate as well whether the routing that is meant to go to that particular IP address is indicative of, in this case, a parked page or a parked service. Thirdly, the name server, again, NS is short for name server, is set it to a stated park or parking name, just like the owning IP address is owned by a parking service, right? Which it could be the RDNS is assigned, speaking of ownership, or it's in the IP ranges, right? It's in the subnets. Attend that lecture if you haven't already, for a particular parking service. So if you looked up cedoparking.com, you could quickly get all the IP ranges that they use, and at least on the surface be able to figure out whether something is on a park page IP for them or not very quickly. Number 4 is that the domain will resolve and respond to all subdomains. We call this a wildcard assignment. Because if you think about it, I may have a simple domain like ion.com. That particular combination of vowels and consonant can get me a lot of common word patterns. And so I could have nation, NATION.com. If that is, I could have nat.ion.com and create a subdomain for nation. If someone wasn't paying attention, they might mistype that and resolve to my ion domain and come to my parked page. Again, taking advantage of users who are not paying attention to what they're typing and get people to come there. Having wildcard assignment is very atypical behavior for a parked page and something we look for. And lastly, the mail exchange, that's what MX is for, again, back into those DNS records, not set for a primary domain. What that means is if the domain was cybersecurity.com, like the example you used earlier, I should see a mail.cybersecurity.com or something similar. If I don't, if I all of a sudden see a Google or a non-reference or reference to some completely other domain, then that is an indicator as well that something has been parked. There's a couple reasons why that's the case, and again, that's a little bit beyond this lecture. I'll go into this in deeper detail later on. That talks about why those are very interesting. But I want to take a second and jump right into tasks. So the common apprenticeship or apprentice tasks you might see as a beginner are to identify a domain, the host name, the website that is parked. To identify a parked page IP by behavior. You see that it has thousands of domains on it. You see that it's in the net ranges for a parking service, etc., etc. You can identify it by its behavior. And lastly, know how to document key park page data. We're going to only touch on a couple of things as we move into the practical here. And again, it won't reflect the service you might be using when you get into an actual position for this, but the data won't change. Just the way it's organized or presented will. All right, so we're going to transition to the practical from here. I'll see you in a second. We made it into our virtual machine. Welcome to the practical side of looking for parked pages or understanding parked pages and parked IP addresses. I'm going to be using a variety of tools, mostly ones that are online and outside of your normal environment. I'm doing that for a couple of purposes. One, because as beginners, these are easier tools for you to reach out to. They're available definitely, and you can get access to them and look things up and try this out yourself. And two, even though you will join a company in the future and move from being an apprentice into a junior, and you will have other tools at your fingertips that may automate many of these tasks or do things better, faster, etc., etc. The basics you'll learn by utilizing these and the pursuits you'll follow will be the same. And so if you can do it here, you can do it there, is that kind of thinking. This gives you a great way to practice. And so let's get right into the practical. Before I do so, let me introduce a few of the tools. You notice I've got them in my browser, as well as I've got a couple items over here that we're going to be inputting in. I said I'd keep it to the basics. And so we're just going to talk basics that we've already mentioned, but just to recover those. Host and IP address known for parked pages. Name server is named after or named for or resolves to a parking service. The mail exchange is not set up for the primary domain. Of course, it will resolve all subdomains. You'll see, if I can slow down my brain here, that they're all yes/no answers, except for up here where you'll input either a domain, IP address, or an IP range, or all of them, depending on what you're trying to do. And the tools we'll be using today are urlscan.io, which we haven't really introduced too much, but it's a wonderful tool that will do scans for us. So if we actually want to see what a particular site looks like, or if we want to do some queries in there, we can, and do it in a safe manner because it's effectively a sandbox for things to be scanned without it going to your local drive, which can be very useful in our practice time here. I'm also going to introduce domain tools. This is the reverse IP lookup, which lets you see how many domains are connected to a particular IP address, including by wildcard. You can do the same thing on domain tools by looking up the name server to understand how many domains are actually pointed at that particular name server, which can help us understand things and answer this question, yes or no. MX Toolbox, which is another new one. This is their super tool that we can decline into these other ones as well. And as it lays out here, it gives you a lot of fun commands that you can run, and you'll see this tool and URL scan more than once, definitely. But for here, we're going to use it in a limited fashion to try to understand things about a particular IP address. And then, of course, securitytrails.com. And again, all these will be down in the description. It also lets us look up domains, IPs, and so forth so we can get more information. And last but not least, Hurricane Electric, their looking glass, their BGP tool allows us to understand not only information about IP addresses, but about the routing. All right, enough of that. Nobody wants to hear me talk. We want to play with some IPs. And so I've recorded down 3 of them. So let's start. We'll just begin with BGP here, since we're kind of already there. So you can see here right off the bat, here's our IP address. We've got an RDNS or a host name. As a reminder, check out those lectures, whether they're a whiteboard or a full-on lecture with slides about what the DNS records are and what they have, what impacts they have, how they define some of the information we collect, and so on. So let's just start. So since this is our IP address and that's our beginning, we'll record this real quick. We're suspicious of this one being, say, a parked page, so we recorded it. We've got the IP range. It's a /19, which is very big in comparison to some of the normal ones we see. And right off the bat, we know that this IP address has 8,123 hosts associated with it. That's a significant number of domains. So we can answer kind of, it's not here because I didn't, but it is IP address contains hundreds or thousands of domains. We could definitely hit this as a yes, because that would be true. Now, one of the reasons I brought up URL scan is if we wanted to look at one of these, we could be careful and copy it, kind of come over here, set it up, make sure we've got it in there properly, and then it will actually scan for us. And we'll just do a public scan. I'll skip going into this in detail, but it'll scan for us. Sometimes it'll throw a captcha out, but it'll look at that website on our behalf in a safe sandbox, so we don't have to worry about if there's some off chance that it is an infected host for some reason or it has infected ads. We won't be bothered by that. And you'll see here, this is sponsored by Security Trails, the other tool that we're using. While that's scanning, oh, it actually finished. Okay, so we see its results. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but here's the IP address, which does indeed match the IP address we had looked at. You get a screenshot that you can click on, and it tells you that this is a page. I don't speak German necessarily, but this is indeed part of their park service. You can also look down in more detail here about things. We want to see if we can find the name server. No, doesn't look like we're going to get it. Didn't redirect us. I don't see many for ads. We have some similars, so lots of similars, which I'm not going to get into right now. So that is a good hint. The fact that it has 81,000 on there is also a good hint. In fact, just like bgp.he.net, Hurricane Electric's setup, we can actually click on the IP in here and see what they have to say. And we can see they don't have nearly as many recorded, but they do have lots of recent snapshots which indicate they are the same. So right now we would have a yes that it contains things. We could test this right here, whether it resolves all wildcards, by coming here and backing up for a second. Let's see if it'll resolve this wildcard. I click search, which is not what I wanted. I want to go home. Send me home. All right, well, that's deciding what it wants to do. There's a couple other things we can do. We can do the reverse IP lookup while we're waiting. See what this one says. Get some feedback on this tool. And it says there's only 3 more than 3. Okay, so it's not going to give us a full number. Sometimes it will. Generally, the way this works is they will take however many domains are total return, and they'll knock off 2 zeros and then say, okay, that's how much it is. So in this case, we definitely had at least 188 returns, because you'll see here in a second that when we have 17,000 or 20,000 or whatever kind of IP or domains that might be on an IP, we'll get a big stinking number here. That won't make much sense. All right, but let's get back to what we're doing here. Oh, not that one. We were working on this one. Will it resolve a wildcard? Well, let's figure it out. Now, this is not the most optimum way to do it, but it is an incredibly safe way to practice as a newcomer. You can make mistakes in the browser here, looking things up in this sandbox in a way that you cannot make if you do it locally. So I'm just going to make something up. Oh, they won't like the question marks, but I'll just make something up. And we'll add it to mbezi.net, and let's see if it resolves. And it does not. Okay, so that's not a good indicator that that's a parked page IP, even though it has an enormous number of domains on it. So this case, we don't, a lot of this depends on a host to make some answers for. I wonder what all of these are set up for as a name server. Let's see what we can find out. Oh, this is a fun one. 1 through 9.de. Let's play with something different for a second. So first, let's switch to that. Oh, there's the CAPTCHA. Parking meter, parking meter, parking meter. Only 3. Good. Did I make it? I made it. Let's see what this says. So I don't want to do an MX lookup, though I can. What I want to do is a name server lookup or a DNS lookup. And it's not going to be helpful, so I will do a DNS lookup, and it will give me back information. It'll tell me what IP it's hosted on. That's awesome, but I really want to look for the name server, which is right there. And so I'll grab that and look that up next. You can also click the transcript, and it gives you more details. Essentially, it runs dig, D-I-G, the same thing that you could run locally if you'd like to. It's really, like I said, this is a safe way to do it in the browser. Easy to practice, easy to mess up. No worries, no muss, no fuss, if you will. So get back the exact same page, not surprisingly. It has the same things. It has the same links. Okay, that's what we're looking for. Well, in that case, you all are using this name server. Ooh, okay, so 30,000. Remember how I said it moves 2 zeros? So 30,000 became 300. So when we saw that 188, that was $188. So in that case, that would have been 18,000 domains pointed to that one. So this is very suspicious for being a parked page IP, especially, though not 100%. This one would fall in the middle for sure. And because of that, I'm not going to finish this. This is really dependent on picking a domain. This is also dependent for picking up a domain. This one, we see that, like we know that this is a parking service. In fact, if you look up domserver.de, you'll see that they provide a parking service. I'm not going to do that right now because I don't want to struggle with trying to understand German. What I will do is switch, and let's see if we can get a better example from someone different. Well, not if we double paste it in there. That's not going to be good. What do we get here? Whoa. All right. So remember I said 2 zeros, right? So if this came back with $19,803, that means you need to push that 2 zeros that way, which is a significant number of IP addresses. 190, wow, 1,980,000. That's a lot of IP addresses. Is that right? Let's find out. Let's check in our looking glass. Yeah, see, it says there's a whole lot less assignments there. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Definitely have some conflicts. What is this? I'm just going to paste it right in there so I don't have to do a bunch of clicking. And of course, it doesn't like it. Sometimes it gets all cranky when you do that directly. We'll give that a second to spin. My VPN's obviously not happy. We could do it here, but it's not necessary. We're seeing similar things. Let's see, what do we got here? Yeah, it's coming back with significant amount of results, but it's kind of all over the place, which is unfortunate, but it does start giving you an understanding. Let's just pick one at random, and it's setting on an IP address that has, as we expected, hundreds of thousands. Same thing here. So you can see there's some massive differences here. The A records versus here, here, where they're saying there is a significant number. So you kind of have to gauge it. Now, here's our hint. So this actually is a good one to work on. So here's our IP address. I'll just type it in instead of being lazy. 91.195.241.137. And of course, our net range, which we can look up here. It's a /23, which is 2. So it's 40 and 41, 2 /24s. Check out that lecture if you don't understand what I'm referring to. I would not put a domain in there because it's less important, but we are seeing 844,097. Yes, and also we're seeing settled parking, so we know that this is indeed, this would be a yes. Let's see if I can do this properly. That's a yes. This would be a yes, and then this is dependent, so let's just pick a couple. Does this have a mail server? It has no MX server. Not set up at all, so this is a yes. That could be or not set up. Will it wildcard? I don't know, will it? No, it doesn't look like it. At least it's not finding records for it. Okay, we could query it directly as well. Yes, well, that's not helpful. What if I do, what did I use here? Let's just pick one. Who did we use here? Oh, we finally got to it. All right. Oh, Capital One phishing. Definitely. And these make sense as far as parked pages. This is CEDU. Okay. Recent scans. We're seeing bot redirects. Okay. So to me, there's enough yeses. This one I would not gauge. This would be incomplete because you just don't know, but you have 4 out of 5 as a yes. I'd flag this tentatively on my preliminary test as being a parked page IP, and then I would go hand it up to a tier 1, tier 2, or junior, senior, that kind of thing to figure out more information. I want to turn this though. Let's, Capital One's a good one. So let's go back to home, and then I want to do a search right on this. And you'll see I broke that because I didn't want to accidentally click on it. That is a very good habit to get into if you're not in on it. So let's scan this one. Oh, we get crosswalk, crosswalk, crosswalk. Should be at least 3. Let's be patient. If you click off, it'll just reset it. I'm going to go with that being a crosswalk. And probably good. Let's see, did we make it? We made it. Okay, while that's spinning, let's put it here as well and switch to a different target. So if it wasn't clear, I'm switching targets to this Capital One fish, which is exactly what it is. This can be a yes or a no. Let's find out together. This one's being a pain. I'll just delete all you guys then. Okay. Capital One, we got a TXT record. We got an IP address. Got Liquid Web. Let's check out this IP address. What do we got here? Well, it's got a few people on it. 192. All right. So let's keep that broken. Let's make it a little smaller though, because I don't want to be blinded by it. Here's our IP address, 75.52.251.2. And it's in a /17. Wow. That is huge. Okay, there we go. And this has got 17 hosts, at least according to them. Let's see what we got here. It is an account suspended page. Surprise, surprise. It is malicious. It was scanned a whole bunch of times. That's for another day. We get the same IP. Definitely. Let's check it out. See what else is on this. Oh yeah, lots more phishing. So not necessarily saying, hey, I'm a parked page, but suspended pages follow the same kind of guidelines as a parked page. So this is a suspended page it's looking like versus a parked one. but we can do a couple other checks here. Let's go to our network tool and put this in. There we go. You can see what it tells us. Same IP, same thing. I could look at the transcript, or I could pull it from right here. It has NS6 and NS5, both on the same IP, it looks like. Oh, I hope not. Let's find out. That's the IP. This is the reverse server. Don't like trailing gaps. This one has 22,236 results. That's a lot of domains pointing to that name server. Now that doesn't mean that that IP is a park page IP. It just means that that name server has a lot of activity on it. So this one hits in the middle. I would put this as definitely not park page, but definitely one that's set up for not only these kind of suspended account pages, but also as as this shows, hosting too. This doesn't have ads or the other things, but it does kind of follow certain modules. So that would fall under detection for, like I said, a account suspended page. So mixed success here. You can see it's not necessarily easy, especially only constraining yourself to 4 or 5 points of data. But this preliminary test can help start the process on, which is why I want to introduce it to you today. So this will all be put in the description. Everything will be available for you. There are other ways to do this, I'll straightforward admit. But once you've identified your parked page IPs, like I was showing there, if we had done pseudo parking, things like that, when you do your queries, one of the things that often comes back in your DNS record is not only the A record and the quad A record, but also the name server. And if it said pseudo parking or parking, cache parking or something like that, you have an indicator that you have something that is a parked page. So I'll leave it at that. There'll be more to come. I'll clean this up later if it needs to and get more information. If you like this video, please give us a like. If you like what we're seeing, if you like what you're seeing here and what we're doing, please follow and subscribe to our channel. And we'll continue to put out these and other things to hopefully make this better and get you as far down the education trail as we can and on into being a junior, senior, and so on in your career. So thank you for your time and have a good one.